And now I give the floor to John.
Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for the invitation to contribute to this Bologna anniversary event. I'm delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to share with you some thoughts, reflections, and brief comments on the Bologna process, and in particular, the social dimension aspect of this process. This contribution to the event started life as a joint paper presentation with my two, co-authors, Nino Schmidt and Robert Napier, I think maybe further back. I'm sure you're going to hear from Robert and Nino later. So this is part of a wider conversation. I'm also, Robert and Nino are the joint chairs of the current Social Dimension Advisory Group, of which I'm also a member. The organising committee then asked for the paper to be given as a keynote. So here I am. I will be speaking about some of the issues that were noted in our original abstract, but limitations of time will mean only one or two, as I won't have time to explore in any detail some of these points. But I'll leave my contact details at the end slide, so if you want to feedback any questions or comments, I'll be happy to relay those to the discussions that are ongoing inside the Social Dimension Advisory Group as it works to deliver its mandate, which I shall come back to. Facilitating an open dialogue in respect to the work of the advisory group is a very important part and way of drawing on the wider body of knowledge and practice relating to the social dimension, of which Chris has alluded to and mentioned. The title for this short talk is Bologna and the Social Dimension Lost in Translation. I think there should be a question mark. I think there was originally a question mark on the title. But in using the word translation here, and no prizes for saying where I got that end bit of the title from, in using the word translation here, I want to suggest that part of the ongoing challenge of the social dimension involves a significant challenge of translating the defining features of the social dimension into policy and practice. And this has been the work of the successive social dimension working groups over the years. This has not been a linear or incremental process, but rather, as we shall see and I shall argue, a fairly uneven one, with valuable points of progress over time that the Bologna process has been operating. I shall point out some of these issues as we explore both the Bologna process and the social dimension. Now, given my limited time, I will confine my commentary efforts to three areas of discussion. First, I will make a few remarks by way of a highly edited overview on the Bologna process itself. I'm sure I've missed things out, but hopefully for those of you who are not familiar with the Bologna process, it will at least provide a starting point. Many apologies in advance to any Bologna historians and experts here, and I know there are some, as my overview remarks will be at best a scene-setting exercise and at worst a quick run-through my personal selection of the key features of Bologna. In this sense, I am less of a Bologna scholar and more of a participant observer with a particular interest in the public good and wider benefits of higher education, which I believe in very strongly. I increasingly realise that the Bologna process is very complex, and as a participant in cooperation with other colleagues, my involvement is just in one part of that current cycle. So therefore I'm going to confine my comments to this part. My second area of discussion will focus on some of the social dimension aspects of the Bologna process, and for this I will be drawing on a combination of documentary sources, but mainly a selection of relevant ministerial communiques which make reference to the social dimension, as well as some of the working papers from the Bologna follow-up group and the advisory groups that form a key part of the working arrangements for each iteration of the process. Finally, I will make a few remarks about the terms of reference to the current advisory group for the social dimension. The outputs from this group will feed into the deliberations for the 2020 ministerial communique and therefore help shape the growing body of knowledge and practice in this crucial area. Before I come to these three areas of discussion, let me give you some background on me and my roles and responsibilities, as this might also give you a clue as to where I'm coming from in my understanding and views on the social dimension. Like most of us these days, I have multiple roles and responsibilities, some of which are set out on this slide. My day job is at the University of East London, where I am Director of Continuum, the Centre for Widening Participation Policy Studies. This is a research and development centre established in 2003, which undertakes a variety of research and near-policy studies, often in collaboration with local and international partners. The Centre, for example, has been commissioned by the London Council's representative body to provide a series of longitudinal studies on the journey of young London learners to higher education, and amongst other things, to address and look at the social dimension of these journeys. At a regional and national level, this work has raised important questions which are directly relevant to the Bologna process in relation to the origins and destinations of learners progressing to higher education. I will come back to this theme and to that of widening participation later on in my talk, as it has been and is an influential umbrella term connected to the social dimension, often with reference to national level policies and strategies. The University of East London has a mission which is driven by its long-term commitment to widening access and participation for more and different learners from communities throughout East London and beyond. My university is therefore very much an anchor institution in the region, providing higher education opportunities to amazingly diverse communities of learners in some of the poorest parts of London, which often have low levels of higher education access, participation and progression. Complementing my role at the University of East London, I'm also a guest professor at Malmö University in Sweden, where I work on a number of higher education, widening access and participation research projects and related initiatives. This role has led to a healthy and productive knowledge exchange and wider cooperation being developed between the two universities, focusing on social dimension type issues and concerns in relation to inclusion, partnership working, city-university cooperation, This, I believe, and many partnerships like this, are much in the spirit of Bologna cooperation. Thirdly, I am chair of FACE, which is the Forum for Access and Continuing Education. This is a professional network which supports and represents widening participation practitioners from across the UK, and which also has strong links with sister networks internationally. Finally, and particularly relevant to my talk today, I mentioned earlier, I am the UK representative on the Bologna Advisory Group for the Social Dimension, 2018 to 2020. And I also previously served as a UK rep on the Social Dimension and Lifelong Learning Group from 2014 to 2015. So I will be drawing on some of my experiential learning in working with these groups. Turning to my first area of discussion, let me offer a brief reminder to you and overview of some of the main features of the Bologna process. The first point to make is that it's based on an intergovernmental cooperation structure which is comprised of 48 participating countries together with the European Commission. There are also a number of consultative members and representatives from the national ministries, in addition to colleagues from student and staff bodies and stakeholder groups in the European higher education area, and so on. The specific composition of the various thematic and advisory groups changes with each cycle of the Bologna process to reflect the areas and priorities in the ministerial communiques, which in turn frames the mandate for such groups. Oversight and management of this process is the responsibility of the Bologna follow-up group, which includes representation from EHEA members. So, what were the founding concerns of the Bologna process? Firstly, I think it's important to note that the Bologna Declaration, which I strongly urge you to read if you haven't already done so, was preceded and informed by the Sorbonne Joint Declaration, which was produced a year before Bologna in 1998. Substantive sections of this declaration were taken up in the Bologna Declaration, including those relating to the social dimension. The Bologna Declaration itself was signed by 29 European countries in 1999 and makes reference to a number of what have since become familiar features across the EHEA landscape, such as a credit transfer system, student-staff mobility, common structure for academic qualifications, and so forth. Importantly, the Declaration highlighted a commitment to educational cooperation, noting that this form of working can contribute to peaceful, stable, and democratic societies. Certainly, in the two working groups I have been a member of, a strong culture of cooperation between members exists. We should not underestimate the value and impact that such cooperation makes to the quality of work undertaken in the various advisory groups. The social dimension, incidentally, is mentioned in the very first paragraph of the Bologna Declaration, so it was very much one of the overarching themes for the Declaration itself. So, how has the Bologna process been progressed? There are two broad phases of Bologna, with Phase 1 from 1999 through to 2010, often characterised as a structural phase in which the setting up of the European higher education area took place, underpinned as it was by the aim of creating a compatible system of higher education with a common structure of qualifications. Phase 2, 2010 and continuing to 2020, is sometimes referred to as the Phase of Consolidation, building on the EHEA, as well as a range of social dimension type developments, such as inclusion, widening access and participation, supporting student success, as well as supporting the wider mobility of students and staff. So from this, we can begin to see the way that aspects of the social dimension are part of an ongoing process and can be intermittent as well as linear. A process which includes the domains of practice, research, and policy to different extents. Moving on to the organisational features of Bologna, essentially, as many of you will be aware, each cycle of the Bologna process comprises of a ministerial meeting every second year, supported by the Bologna follow-up group. A major output from this is a ministerial communique signed off by the member countries. The Bologna follow-up group has the responsibility to progress the commitments made in the communique and does this through the appointment of a series of working and advisory groups, which in turn are tasked with progressing the specific terms of reference framed by the Bologna group and agreed by the ministerial group. The Bologna follow-up group meets at least every 6 months and is supported by a secretariat drawn from the country which is hosting the ministerial meeting for that particular cycle. As Italy is the host for this cycle, the next ministerial level meeting will take place in Rome in 2020. So the plans and terms of reference for each of the current themes, including the social dimension, are presently being worked on by a series of groups which, with oversight from the Bologna follow-up group. The groups will present their reports and related papers in time for the Rome ministerial meeting and communique. So, let me now turn to my second discussion area, the social dimension, and offer some brief comments of where this fits into the Bologna process. Various commentators have identified the social dimension as being a moving target, which means in practice that there's been a variable degree of emphasis given to the social dimension in the different communiques over time. Some instances, the social dimension features prominently, and others less so. Given this, in the next few slides, I shall attempt to highlight this moving target aspect by drawing on a small textual analysis of references made in a sample of ministerial communiques and related developments across the 2 phases of Bologna I noted previously. If we go back to the original Bologna Declaration, of which this slide is a part, we find that the social dimension is included in a list of key influential factors at the very start of the declaration itself. From its positioning in the text, it seems to be the case that the social dimension was regarded to be an overarching theme and part of the vision to create what is described in the declaration as part of a growing awareness in the public, academic, and political spheres of the need to establish a more complete and far-reaching Europe. the social dimension being foregrounded as a critical feature of this vision of Europe, which, as the Declaration goes on to say, is building on and strengthening its intellectual, cultural, social, and scientific and technological dimensions. Change in this, in turn, has been the consequences for the social dimension and how it contributes to this change amongst members of the EHEA. By the time of the Berlin ministerial meeting in 2003 and Bergen in 2005, we see that the language and position of the social dimension has shifted. So, for example, in the case of the Berlin Communique, there is a call to improve the social characteristics of the EHEA as a way of balancing the increased emphasis on competitiveness. The Bergen Communique offers, in contrast to previous communique standards, a rather detailed description of the social dimension, as we can see from this slide. It refers to the measures taken by governments, which includes help to students especially from socially disadvantaged groups. The help being provided should include financial as well as guidance and counselling relating to widening access to opportunities in higher education. As a number of commentators have pointed out, care needs to be taken not to create a deficit model of the very learners that are being focused on and supported to access and excel in higher education. When we reached the London Communique in 2007, we arguably find the most detailed and concrete definition of the social dimension so far. So, for example, the London Communique talks about the student body entering higher education, and it should reflect all our populations across Europe. It also refers to a variety of student services, recognising the point that Chris made, which is that success and excellence need to be supported and properly reflected in the services available to students. The London Communique also uses the discourses of widening participation and equal opportunities. So, although there have been several iterations of the social dimension in subsequent communiques, the London formulation marks a step change in attempts to define the social dimension, and it has had a significant influence on subsequent communiques. We can see a strong echoes of this in some of the national plans and strategies in a number of EHEA member countries. The take-up and implementation of the social dimension proposals and developments in the EHEA member states has been explored in, for example, the work of the PL4SD, I always get this wrong, project, which undertook mapping exercises across the Bologna member countries. This suggests that there's considerable positive interaction between the Bologna level process and its pronouncements and concerning the institutional and national level policy developments. This mutual engagement and cooperation has also been proactively supported by the various social dimension advisory groups over time. So the London Communique defines the social dimension in relation to who goes to higher education, participates in it, and completes their higher education studies. Furthermore, the definition also recognises the structural and operational challenges this involves when it identifies the need to create learning pathways into access and within progression, higher education. This interpretation of the social dimension also recognises, as I've mentioned, equal opportunities and widening participation imperatives at all levels, undergraduate, postgraduate and doctoral studies. I'm now going to move to the final discussion area by fast forwarding a decade to the 2018 Paris Communique. Here we can see a strong alignment with the London Communique, both in language and intent. Specifically, the ministers acknowledged and agreed that the following needed to be addressed in the 2020 ministers' meeting. Firstly, social dimension needs to be strengthened. Secondly, the higher education population reflects the diversity of Europe's populations. And thirdly, a common understanding of the social dimension needs to be developed. Before I conclude, let me, in the next slide, note some of the challenges which have arisen and been addressed, are beginning to be addressed by the advisory group. These include data collection and comparison at national level, the different understandings of the social dimension between countries and within and between HEIs, higher educational institutions, and also divergence between Bologna objectives and national objectives in social dimension policies. And finally, the consistency of monitoring arrangements. These ongoing challenges form part of the backdrop to the work of the advisory group and the social dimension, and are currently being progressed through the group's terms of reference. So let me finish then with a final slide that sets out the terms of reference for the current social dimension group going forward to 2020. And as I said at the beginning, I'm very happy to receive any comments or suggestions. The slides will be made available to you and feed these in to the deliberations of the Social Dimension Advisory Group as it moves forward to its report in 2020. So I will leave you with these thoughts and also, of course, my contact details to pass on any comments. Thank you very much for your attention.